Well, good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. It's time to get started. Quiet down out there. Especially you, baby. She's been upset all morning. 379 after the lesson. This morning we're going to look at Matthew chapter 19 in the second half of it. Second half of it, especially starting in verse 11, 10 even. 10, the disciples said to him, if the relationship between a man and a woman is like this, it's better not to marry. That's the New American Standard that says that. Let's see what the ESV says. ESV says, the disciples said to him, if such is the case of a man with his wife, it's better not to marry. And Jesus says, you don't know how right you are. Right? That's essentially what he says. He starts talking about, in reality, he starts talking about eunuchs and these people that have been mutilated. But let's back up. Before we get down too many rabbit trails, let's look at the big picture here. We have the specific mention of the kingdom of heaven here in chapter 19. We have that specifically mentioned as the motivation for this unconventional ethic that Jesus is promoting here, especially in verse 12, when we're talking about, of chapter 19, when we're talking about, for there are eunuchs who have been made so from birth, and there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by men, and there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Let the one who is able to receive it, receive it. So this kingdom of heaven is the motivation for the ethic that Jesus is promoting here. And that mention of the kingdom is drawing a contrast between what was widely believed in this time period, right? It's between what our human thoughts are and what the thoughts of God are, right? So chapter 16 and verse 23, Jesus is discussing that, and he says, it's on the next page, Peter says, far be it from you, Lord, this should never happen, right? He says the same thing essentially here in chapter 19. It's better not to marry. What does Jesus say? But he turned and Peter said, get behind me, Satan. You are a hindrance to me, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man. And so in chapter 19 here, we have this continual repetition of this word kingdom. We have it in verse 12. We have it in verse 14. We have it in verse 23. We have it in verse 24. And if we want to include the first verse of the next chapter, chapter 20, verse 1. And then if we take all that together, this talk about this new ethic of what it's going to look like in the kingdom, Jesus then contrasts that to the kingdoms of this world and the kings of this world, right? In Matthew chapter 20 and verse 25. And this whole focus of kingdom behavior is going to be that main focus that follows with the disciples throughout the remainder of this journey to Jerusalem, right? So this chapter is about how kingdom life and how members of the kingdom act in this world. We cannot get away from it. It's mentioned 4 times, 5 times if you want to include the first verse in the next chapter. So Jesus finds that within the Torah, within the law of Moses, he finds 2 different levels of ethical instruction. And I wanted to go over this again because we went over it last time. In Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 1 through 4, there's been a provision made by Moses for dealing with a problem that has already come up. But in Genesis 1 through 2, Jesus is giving this crucial piece of evidence to show them that the first principles of God, if they would observe them, would have created this whole debate, would not have created the whole debate, would have rendered the whole debate moot, unnecessary. And so these principles are the standard that we are held to, is what Jesus is saying, not the exception. And so Jesus doesn't answer their question immediately, right? They're asking for what's a good What's a good reason for divorce? Jesus says you better look for reasons to keep your wife, is what he says. So Jesus doesn't answer the question because not looking for a cause of divorce or looking for a cause for divorce is not the root issue. Not living according to the values of the rule of God, right? Not living according to the values of the kingdom of heaven is the issue. And so Jesus is going to camp out in Genesis to define what humans are. We studied that last week, and what marriage is. And so this discussion from here on out now is going to discuss how we apply those things in the kingdom of heaven. How we apply those ethics in the kingdom of heaven. And how whoever divorces his wife, except for sexual sin, is breaking those ethics because he's breaking the intention of creation, which is to be the reflection of God. And so he says that if you can't live up to that initial reflection of God, then it's okay to not take a wife. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's look at Jesus' view on marriage so we can remember where we're at. Right? Jesus starts teaching about the one flesh and how it was made male and female. Male and female is from the image of God poem in Genesis chapter 1 and verse 27 and 28. And Jesus assumes that you know the whole poem. When he says they were created male and female, and he's quoting from that, he assumes that you would think male and female made in the image of God. Like the whole package comes. You don't just get to pull one little piece of a verse out and not get the whole context. And then he starts teaching about they were made one flesh when they were brought together. Genesis 2 and verse 24, right? And that it's only because of sexual unfaithfulness, some versions say sexual immorality, it's only because that sexual immorality has already violated that unity of the one flesh that marriage can no longer be intact. Nothing else breaks that bond except for sexual unfaithfulness, or fornication is the word he uses in English. Porneia is the word in the Greek. So the Pharisees were concerned with who can initiate this divorce, right? You see the difference, though, between what Jesus said and what the Pharisees said. They were worried about who can divorce. And Jesus says this is not about initiating divorce. This is about defining what a marriage is so that we can then decide what breaks that marriage. And so Jesus says that marriage is sacred. Marriage is to provide an image of that covenant love that God has. God is a unity of multiple beings who all have covenant love for each other. And when they come together, they come and they produce life here on this earth. That is the image of a male and a female coming together and forming life here on this earth. So this all seems very, very distant from us in our own culture, right? Because we have this soaring divorce rate in our country, right? We have divorce for any reason. We have this widespread assumption that marriages cannot be expected to last for life. And if this teaching seems foreign to that thought process, it is. But it was even more foreign in Jesus' day. So we don't need to soften this because it's somehow different today. Divorces were even easier to get, arguably, in the first century, especially by men. And by the time Jesus comes around, women were allowed to divorce because Roman law had taken over, and the woman was allowed to divorce under Roman law in certain circumstances. And so it was no less radical during Jesus' day in the Jewish world and in the Roman world, where divorce was even easier to obtain than it is for us. Jesus is laying down a challenge to the accepted norms, and he demands a complete rethink of what marriage is. And it's not on the basis of human convenience. It's not on the basis of human happiness, but for the purpose of God in creation. And I think a major aspect of this that we miss is that we view this through some 21st century lens, right? Because those are the glasses that we have on. And we don't realize what is actually happening here. Who is Jesus standing up for? Who could initiate a divorce under Jewish law, under the law of Moses? Who could initiate it? It was only the man. Jesus is standing up for women in this situation. Jesus embeds his argument in the creation narrative, not in, well, he said, she said, therefore it's okay for me to. That's not what's happening. He's going back to the creation narrative because he is talking to people who, in his mind, are perpetrating injustice, oppression. They're imposing their distorted views onto women, right? And so is marriage the only way? Let me just back up. Male and female, they come together. I've said this several times. They come together. They make a vow of covenant love for each other. And out of that love, new life is generated. And so the purpose of marriage is compromised by a view of marriage that says that the marriage covenant can be broken by any reason in divorce. The purpose of God's creation for us and his covenant with us is broken when we say that we can get divorced for any reason. That is the main point of this section. As we move on to the response of the disciples here, we then need to ask ourselves, is marriage the only way to reflect God's image out into the world? And I would say no. We're going to find out here in the next few verses, but there was a commonly held belief, there is a commonly held belief, within this church that we often pressure single people, right, to get married, especially young adults who are getting into that marriage age. We even have names for it, right? Because that's where true happiness lies, right? And that's where you find true fulfillment is in marriage. And that's just not true. And I think that is overtly wrong, and that we need to talk some more about sex today. And we need to look at what it means to find happiness outside of sex and outside of a marriage relationship. And I am here to tell you it is possible. Despite what the TV tells you about sex being the ultimate goal of happiness and pleasure in our life, I'm here to tell you that that is not the case. So first, after Jesus says these radical things that really would have gone against all of the norms of both Roman and Jewish society during this time period, after he says these things, the disciples respond astounded. This is clearly surprising to them, Jesus' response. This is not something that they had heard before Jesus teach on, right? So why get married then is essentially their response, right? It's better not to marry. And Jesus responds and he says, the single life is an exceptional gift. It is not the rule. So let me back up a little bit. What kind of culture would you have to grow up in that would generate a response like, it's better not to get married if I can't get divorced? What kind of culture would you have to grow up in? The culture of the Pharisees, that is, where marriage is an institution that exists to please men, right? Moses, he says, if you find something displeasing in her, right? Deuteronomy 24 and verse 1 through 4. And Jesus comes along and he says that this is totally not God's vision, what you guys are doing here. Their culture has told them that marriage exists to please them, the man, and to make them happy. And the moment that someone is not happy, it's over. And the disciples say, no way, it's better not to marry, right? And so Jesus, he just slams on the brakes and he says that is not God's vision for what marriage is. It depends on how we want to take the disciples, their response here in verse 10. if we take it as ironic or whatever, it doesn't matter, because Jesus and his words, he takes them as the basis of a serious response. It doesn't matter if they were just trying to exaggerate and say, well, it's better not to get married then. Well, Jesus takes them as the basis for a serious response. And so what is Jesus' response then? What is Jesus' response to that saying of, it's better not to marry then? In essence, he says, you're more right than you realize. And I said this earlier. In reality, unfortunately, or fortunately, depends on how you look at it, he starts talking in parables again, right? Instead of saying you're more right than you realize, he says, well, here's a saying about eunuchs. And it's very confusing to us today, but we should probably define what a eunuch is. We did this in the Bible class, but I need to do this right now also for the benefit of those people who are listening who are not at the Bible class here. So we need to define what a eunuch is, because we need to find out culturally what is going on here. And so let me just give a good description of what a eunuch is, or a eunuch was, in the ancient world, and just so that we're all clear. This is not generally a practice that is practiced today, except in a few rare cases. This is not a very common practice, but this was a practice. Think about this. Remember, I said, what kind of culture would have produced this? What kind of culture produces a eunuch? What kind of culture produces an individual who has his genitalia mutilated, right? And I don't mean just a little extra skin clipped off. I mean the whole thing clipped off. And so this practice is going to originate in a polygamous culture, right? Where kings can take much property and many wives. And who are you going to get to work the palace and overlook the property and your harem? And are you going to trust that to a woman? You're not going to trust that to a woman, because they're a woman, right? You need a man. Well, a man who's not a threat to you. And so you remove that threat. You have male servants that have had their manhood chopped off. They've had their genitals removed. So you can unconditionally ensure that they didn't take any of what belonged to the king, whether that was the wives or other things, because they couldn't survive in the culture around them because they weren't accepted. It was only in this particular role that they were accepted. Stop the possibility of illegitimate children, right? And so Jesus is using this example of eunuchs to categorize a people who would not have sex, who would never get married, and they would never have children, right? So the first 3 points on the slide, I want you to remember that, ingrain that in your mind, because that is what the marriage debate is about. That's what this eunuch debate is about, and that's what the rest of this chapter is about when we come and we talk about finding happiness, whether it's in wealth. Wealth would bring you a marriage that you desired, or maybe multiple marriages so that you could have sex with multiple women. It would bring you children. It would do these things for you that are supposedly pleasing to you and that are the purpose of life. Remember, Jesus is using this example of eunuchs to categorize a group of people who will not have sex, who will not get married, and who will not have children. These are not a threat to the king anymore, because that's what he's worried about. He's worried about his lineage, his harem, and his sex, having sex with the partners that he wants to. And so this would have been obvious to the people reading chapter 19, the people it was intended to be written for. And so I can imagine the people who are reading this saying, yeah, Jesus, but what's your point? Like, yeah, there's eunuchs. What about them? How does that apply to our situation here? And Jesus says that some were made that way by kings. Yeah, well, that's the one everybody knew about. Some were born that way. Well, yeah, some people are born with birth defects or whatever. But Jesus doesn't speak as if these things are negative, right? He even says that some people choose to live this way themselves. And there's one glaringly obvious thing here. Jesus is acknowledging that the categories that he just defined, male and female, he's declaring that they're maybe not quite so neat and clean that we think they are, but that God formed them that way in the womb. Right? We know there's the fact of birth defects, right? We know that people are born differently. And the last thing Jesus says here is the kicker, though, that some people choose to live this way, right? Jesus is describing himself. Jesus says that there are those who choose a life of not having sex, of not getting married, or having children. For what purpose? Why would somebody choose to live that way? For the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Because there is something that is ultimately more meaningful than 30 minutes of pleasure. And for Jesus, the purpose of his life is not pleasuring ourselves sexually, but it's the kingdom of God. And for some human beings, what their representation of what it means to be in the image of God in this world means getting married and reflecting the covenant of love with God out into the world to create new life. The two become one and creates new life. But I'll ask the question again, is marriage the only way to reflect the covenant love of God? And I would have to answer no. Because Jesus is saying that you can live a meaningful life without having sex. That's some sort of alien gibberish to our culture, right? To the vast majority of our culture and to their culture. This is alien gibberish. We have grown up, especially in the last, 30 plus years, in the most visually, sexually stimulated culture in the history of the human race. If you lived in the time of Rome, you actually had to leave your house to go somewhere where you could see those sexually oriented things, whether it was at the temple or whatever it was. Now we don't even have to leave our home to go do those things. So, our culture, especially, and starting with their culture too, they did it too, we have completely separated sex from procreation. And I am not prude enough to stand up here and tell you sex is only for procreation. That's not what I'm saying. But we've done that so much. We've removed sex from procreation, so much so that sex is now a commodity. It's now something that I do because it feels good and not for a purpose of fulfilling a covenant. What is the best and most highest meaning in life, in our culture, that it's screamed at us all day long? And that is life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. What's the ultimate happiness for us? It's sex. And that's right next to the high pedestal that our society has put sex on, is the idea ingrained in us, and this is something that happens in the church, I've said it multiple times already, that the ultimate fulfillment in life is through marriage. And so it's this completely logical thing then, it's completely logical, that now that we have redefined marriage, and we have redefined it, we have separated it from gender, that sex is separated from procreation and from being inside of marriage. Is it any surprise then? Is it any surprise that we are in such a mess socially in this country with the divorce rates soaring and families being broken all around us? Is it really a surprise when that happens? Because we've redefined marriage as not being a good covenant between a male and a female, but whoever wants to get married. And we've redefined sex as not being inside of marriage as a fulfillment of the covenant, but as being a right to make me happy, because we've removed it from any form of procreation. Is it any surprise then that our society and our country is in this situation? And if you think that that's all outside the church building, that's wrong. Divorce is something that happens to many within the church. And so it's something that we need to address ourselves also, right? People like to talk about the old days, right? About when things were God and country. Well, I've already said it, but it's ingrained in our Constitution, this idea of happiness as a right, and that it's the highest pursuit that we need to do in our life. And Jesus says that sex is not the ultimate goal of life. Yes, that it's a part of life, but sex is not the goal of our life. The kingdom of heaven is the goal. And even more jarring for us is that Jesus says that getting married and having a family is not the only pathway within the kingdom. Jesus, he sees this life of covenant love for those who choose to not have sex, to choose to not get married, and choose to not have children. And he sees that as being on a completely different level from marriage. And so, what comes next in the chapter then is a series of stories that seem like they're disconnected. They seem like they're disconnected. But we're gonna make that connection here this morning. We have a series of stories dealing with family and with social values, and we have these stories after these conversation that he's been having related to marriage and divorce. And so we come to children. And here we find that the disciples, they still have a lot to learn, right? They've already tried to turn the children away one time in chapter 18 and verse 4. And we have this recurring phrase now in the next few verses. We have the phrase, the kingdom of heaven, in verse 12. Now we have it in verse 14, and again in verse 23, and verse 24, in chapter 20, and verse 1. And this is keeping our primary focus on the kingdom of heaven in these chapters. These value systems that Jesus is teaching is upside down compared to the world around him. They are vastly different. And so the instructions to become like children in chapter 18 is not about adopting some sort of supposed ethical consideration, right? This is not about, how innocent a child is necessarily. It's okay if you believe those things. I'm just saying that my view is that it's not about those things, because if you've ever been on a playground, children are pretty terrible little people if you've ever been around them very long. Have you ever seen a kid push another one head first down a slide? Just like that. Almost kills them. This is not about being a child literally. This is about accepting the social position which is like that of a child or a slave. That is the lowest in the hierarchy of authority and decision-making is your position, and those who subject themselves and are dependent on the adults, which would be God and Jesus in this situation. And so the phrase, take a lowly position there in chapter 18, really confirms that to us. And it is mirrored here in chapter 19 by the phrase, such is the kingdom of heaven. That lowly position is the kingdom of heaven. And we're going to find out a little bit later, right? What does he say at the very last verse of this chapter? But many who are first will be last, and the last will be first. if we make ourselves like children, we will be first in the kingdom of heaven. If we are unimportant, if we are the oppressed ones, if we do not retaliate when people do bad things against us, we will be first in the kingdom of heaven. And so the disciples' question about being great there in chapter 18 is prompted by this desire to exercise authority over other people, right? They want to be the ruler. In chapter 17, Jesus has said that he's leaving this earth. He's going to die. And they didn't focus on the resurrection part. It's like they forgot about that part when he said that. They said, oh, well, who's going to be the greatest? Who's going to take your place, Jesus? The same thing is happening here in chapter 18 or 19, and next week in chapter 20, we'll have a mirror image of the same thing when the mother of the sons of Zebedee come and asks for her children to be first and second place. So their desire to be great has started at the wrong end of the spectrum. Their sort of grown-up sense of social positioning puts them out of line, puts them in conflict with the values of the kingdom of heaven, he says in verse 14. So, how does that relate to a rich guy who's called a rich young ruler in Luke? He's not called a ruler here, so I won't be calling him that this morning, but we have another one approaching Jesus. We have another story of an individual who approaches Jesus, and he's someone from the outside of the disciple group. This is not a disciple, somebody from outside the group. But this man's social standing, right, is very conspicuous, and it's conspicuously contrasted to the lack of social significance that a child has here. So Jesus, who just blew their mind by welcoming little ones, here is going to make matters worse in their mind by turning away a great one, right? So they've just had their minds blown. They just said, well, it's better not to marry. And if you thought that was strong language, wait till we get to the end of this story when they say, who then can be saved? The disciples, their great astonishment is going to really originate from the common assumption that wealth was a sign of God's blessing and his reward for faithful service. I mentioned this in the class, and I said the wrong chapter. It's Deuteronomy chapter 28 is the chapter we're looking for. Deuteronomy 28, verses 1 through 14, if you want to read that. It's a biblical idea that God would bless you if you followed him. So that when Jesus, he kind of declares something that sounds different, though. He declares that instead, wealth is an impediment to salvation. And that declaration is not in contrast with God blessing you. It's in contrast with the fundamental part of their worldview that said, God will bless me because of what I believe or what I have done. And so Jesus' demand on this rich man is expressed in terms of his own perfection, right? So treasure in heaven and discipleship is what is going to be given for this perfection. But I want to make the point here that we so often miss, and that is, it is his actual wealth. It is the money in the bank that he has and his attitude toward it that is in focus. We often say, oh, well, it's just his attitude towards the money. It's not the money itself. Money itself is not evil, but the love of money, right? It's the love part that's the problem. Well, yes, but he says that money is the actual problem too here, right? Affluence here, wealth, is a danger to the owner of that wealth. We can't blur the line here. Let's go back to Matthew chapter 6. So on the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is up there, blessed are the poor, blessed are the meek. Yeah, that sounds great, Jesus, except I don't want to be poor. Right? Let's read Matthew chapter 6 and verse 19, starting in verse 19. Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth. That's pretty simple. What does that mean? Pretty simple. Don't save a bunch of money and hoard it. Where moth and rust destroy, where thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, or where thieves break in and steal, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. I'll stop there. Jesus' demand on him is that the discipleship and the pursuit of wealth are fundamentally incompatible. Jesus says this explicitly there in verse 19 of chapter 6. Where your treasure is, your heart will be also. And then he repeats it there in verse 24. You cannot serve two masters. It's not only Jesus' original disciples who find this saying uncomfortable, right? We should find that saying uncomfortable too. Because taken at face value, these Old Testament principles, they sum up a conventional Jewish view, first century Jewish view of what it meant to be good. Right? And that would be how the young man takes them, right? He's done well for himself. God has blessed him. So he has no difficulty claiming, and probably very sincerely, right, like Paul does in Philippians chapter 3 and verse 6, that he has kept the law, that he has led a good life, that he has given to the poor. And is that all there is to life? Is doing this checklist of things? And I think this young man, he deserves credit. We often get down on him for his attitude at the end, but I think he deserves credit here for the perception that there is more to life than just following the commandments. There's more to serving God, and therefore finding eternal life than filling out the checklist, than just conventional morality. Being a good person is not what gets you into heaven. And this young man realizes this, even when it's directly based on the requirements of the law, of the old law. Following the law is not what got you into heaven. And so his initial question was looking for something more. He was searching. He's not prepared to just be brushed away by just a system of rules, right? He's more spiritually involved in that. He knows there's more out there to this world. And so Jesus recognizes that, and he responds to his spiritual ambition, right? The man actually wants nothing than the best for his service to God. And merely keeping the commandments has not brought him to that point. He wants to be perfect. That word in Greek is teleos. It's a word that denotes not so much a moral perfection or flawlessness as it does completeness, a full maturity. And so that's what Jesus wants for this person too. And he does want this for all of his disciples also, right? Remember Sermon on the Mount, chapter 5 and verse 48, when he says, "You therefore must be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect." So perfect is going to sum up this theme of righteousness that's greater than that of the Pharisees and the scribes, chapter 5 also. But this perfection is, according to this same verse, the characteristic of God, who has just been declared in verse 17 here of chapter 19. Verse 17 says, "There is only one who is good." Perfection is, according to verse 17 here. Good. And so the young man's request for some good thing has to do. Sorry, let me back up. I have my notes wrong here in the English syntax. So, this young man, he's requesting a good thing to do. And that action, that request, has brought him face to face with goodness at a level that will prove to be too high for him. Right? The goodness of keeping the commandments is, like verse 17 has reminded us, it's always relative. Jesus is now replaces it with a demand that is absolute. And that is the demand of the kingdom of heaven. Truly I say to you, with difficulty, only with difficulty, a rich person will enter the kingdom of heaven. Again, I tell you, it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to enter the kingdom of heaven. So, where does that put us here in chapter 19? How do we tie all these things together? We have Jesus' views on marriage, which go back to the creation, which show us that we are just male and female. We often think of ourselves in this high social status that I could not possibly be with so-and-so because they're a lower status than me. Or maybe we don't feel like we fit into one of those categories of male and female. Or maybe we're tempted by members of the same sex. If we cannot live up to that initial way that Jesus portrays marriage, of being between a man and a woman, Jesus says that some people are given the gift of being able to not to marry. And that we need to let the one who is able to receive that, receive it. When it comes to wealth, when it comes to children, socially, we need to not push away those people who look different than us. Those people wearing shabby clothes, who smell, who we're scared of because we don't know who they are or what they're going to do. We don't need to push those people away in favor of people who are rich. Because it's easier for the person who is at rock bottom to be saved than it is the person who's rich, right? Because with God, all things are possible. With God, you will be able to inherit life if you are willing to give up those things that are controlling you, whether it's wealth or something else in your life. And if you're willing to make yourself like a child, to be the lowest on the social structure, if you're willing to do that, if you are willing to do that, if you're willing to be last, you will be first in the kingdom of heaven. That's the way this chapter winds up. That's the way I want this lesson to wind up, right? If you want to be like Jesus, and you're willing to give up sex, you're willing to give up marriage, if you're willing to give up children, Jesus says that that is perfectly fine to live that way in this life. Himself, using himself as the prime example, the first religious leader. If we just look at historically, the first major historical religious leader who didn't have a wife, who didn't have sex with random people. That's who Jesus is. He was willing to give up those things because there was something more important in his life. And I'm not saying that value is for everyone, but I am saying it is an option for those who really want to dedicate themselves to God, who find themselves in difficult circumstances. And if you want to talk about any of those difficult circumstances, please contact us here at the church. My email here at the church is sitkachurch@gmail.com, SITKA church itchurch@gmail.com. If you want to talk about things that are not often talked about, like sexual desires and things like that that are causing you trouble, please contact us. If this morning, if you want to make a commitment to be like Jesus, if you want to be a servant of His, if you're ready to give up your chasing after wealth, you're chasing after sex, women, whatever it happens to be, if you want to give up those things and live for the kingdom of God, we can help you with that this morning. If you need to do any of that, please contact us here at the church, and we can help you with those things. That's the lesson from chapter 19. Next week, we'll look at chapter 20, and several of these stories are repeat or playing off of the themes that we've already looked at. So I'm going to focus really hard on connecting the dots for the last couple stories. I've got the questions to hand out. If you'd like a copy of the questions, contact me at sitkachurch@gmail.com also, and I'll send those out to you. Thanks, everybody, for being here this morning. Have a good morning.